And we have these webinars about once every 2 weeks or so. If you are not a member of the PIRL network and you would like to be, you can contact myself or someone else who's a member of the PIRL network. That's probably how you heard about the PIRL project. So today we are really excited to have the discussion about what it means to read the literature. Reading the literature is both exciting and challenging at times. For those of you who have been involved in reading the literature, you know what I'm referring to. And when we were putting together this session, we thought of who was in our network who would be a good person to involve. And Dr. Patrick Okwen came to mind. If I was to do a proper introduction of him, that would be the first 20 minutes of this webinar. So I'm not going to do a full introduction. Let me just say that Dr. Okwen is very well known internationally, has been very involved in contributing to research in very creative ways, and has done so much to help people understand about how to read and really use the literature and to use the knowledge that we have out there. Today's session is going to be quite interactive. I am going to be directing traffic. I'm going to keep everyone muted, but we do have two people who are going to be monitoring the chat. And I would really ask you to keep your microphone and your video camera off during the session. Please use the chat function to type your questions and comments, and we will call on you specifically by name if there is something that we would like you to contribute. So Luis and Leonard would be monitoring the chat and jumping in at various times to tell us what's happening in the chat. We'd like to get started by inviting you to introduce yourself in the chat. So type your introduction. Please don't say your introduction, but type your introduction in the chat. Tell us your name, the kind of work that you're doing, where you are in the world, and if you feel like, you know, adding something about your interest in literature and research for disability inclusive development, please feel free to include that. As I said, my name's Lynn Coburn. I am one of the PIRL coordinators, and I'm quite interested in inclusive research, and I have been involved in projects in Cameroon for many years. So having said that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Okwen. Please go ahead, Dr. Okwen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Okwen. I'm a medical doctor and a researcher, mostly doing a lot of work in evidence implementation. And I'm also the team lead at eBase Africa. I'm also district medical officer at the Bali district. And I'm really happy to be able to contribute to this webinar within the network, within the PIRL network. And thank you very much, Lynn. I'm very humbled by your introduction. So thank you.
You're welcome. We're getting a little bit of noise from behind you, so I'm not sure if that's something you might be able to manage a bit. And it seems like perhaps we lost Dr. Okwen. But I
No,
you're there.
I'm
okay,
here.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I was already done with the introduction. I don't know if you would want me to go into the slides already.
Just go ahead, please. Yeah.
Okay, so I am done with with my introduction. So I'm happy for you to let me know if I should go on with the slides.
Yes, please go ahead with the slides. Are you seeing them?
Yes, but they are not yet on my slides. Maybe you will have to control the slides to my set of slides. It's still on the first slide, and I don't think I have control over them.
Okay, so by the end of this session, we hope that you will have at least 10 strategies that you can use to make reading the literature easier and better. I mentioned that we're using the chat area a lot today, so please do use the chat. If you're not familiar with it, the chat feature you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Okwen, do you want to go through the examples or would you like me to?
Okay, let me go through the examples. So can you move the slides?
Yeah, it's on real life example number 1.
Okay, for some reason, I don't seem to see it. I'm still at the title slide.
Maybe there's something with your connection.
No, it's not the connection only. Maybe Lynn, you check. The slides are not moving.
Okay, so I have control on the slides now. I think I can move them. Okay.
Oh, I see what, I'm sorry. I see what happened. It was open in 2 places. So I was doing something else.
Okay.
So. Okay, let me stop sharing. Sorry, we're really having technical problems today. What are you seeing now?
I think you stopped sharing.
Here we go. How's that? I'm really sorry. I'm not sure what's happening because I'm sharing my screen.
Okay. Your screen is sharing now. Okay. So we will now look at the 3 examples to get us started, and we'll come back to them.
Can you make it full screen? I don't have control now that you have control. Can you go to the full screen option, please?
Yeah, I think you took the control, but I'm requesting it now. So, okay, I have the control. Okay. Oops.
Okay, you know what? I can control from this side. I think we've solved the problem.
Okay.
And I think now, are you seeing real life example number 1?
Yes, that's better.
Great, okay, Thank you. Go ahead. I'm so sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Technology is sometimes tricky. So we are going to look at some real life examples. As Lynn said earlier, reading literature on effectiveness and what works is could be very exciting, could be a lot of fun, but it could also be very challenging because sometimes it's hard to tell exactly what's good literature and what's not good literature, sometimes to understand exactly what the authors are saying. So we'll start with the first real life example, where an established researcher tells you they would like to do some research on the impact of disabilities for people in your community or your city or your village or wherever you live. They live in the community and recently became aware of how important disability or social inclusion and rehabilitation services are. And they also believe that there has not been much that has been done to understand the experiences of people living with disabilities or the prevalence of disabilities in your area. Until now, their research has been in another area, and they have not really considered how disability impacts their own work. So what I would like us to reflect on and discuss about in the chat box is, what would you tell them? Please just type your suggestions in the chat if possible. Elaine, about how much time would we have for everyone to type in the chat?
I think you just keep going with the examples so that we can get through everything.
Okay, so probably if the question can be typed and put in the chat so that everyone could make reference to it, if we move away from this slide, maybe Luis will be able to handle that. Just put that in the chat so that everyone can refer to it. Okay, next slide then. Okay, so real life example number 2. We are a small organization doing big work, as many organizations that we have in Africa are. We are currently searching for evidence for some variables in our family-centered toolkit and was hoping you could be of help. We are looking for evidence to back these up. Please, could you help with just a quick search? Not such a rigorous search will be of great help. And the variables that we are looking at for you to help us to search and post in the chat is leaving an inheritance for people with disability. What does the literature say about that? What does research say about families leaving an inheritance for children with disabilities? We know the challenge in our context, in our culture, what they believe about people with disability, and people may not want to will land or property to them. But we want to know from research what research says, what research thinks about leaving inheritance for people with disability. Creating a bank account for children with disabilities. Many parents who have regular kids do have bank accounts, either in the post office or something of that nature, or even in Jangi houses, in credit unions. But the question is, will they also do the same for children with disabilities? What the literature, what the research says about creating a bank account for children with disabilities. And then creating legal documents for people with disability. This includes legal documents like birth certificates, disability cards, national identity cards, passports for travels, and other documents that are required for kids to have to establish their civil status. Then discussing and knowing children with disabilities' future aspirations. Talking with the child who has a disability, what do you want to be in future? How to get to know children with disabilities' favorite things, like their favorite colors, their friends, their foods, their actors, musicians, etc. and also allowing children with disability to make household decisions. Sometimes, for example, what will be the cook? What will they cook in the house? Please type your suggestions in the chat if possible, and then we will come back to it. Next slide, please. So while you are reflecting on that or doing the search, I would also want to share with you some experiences that we've had learning from research evidence. So as mentioned earlier, I'm team lead at eBase Africa, and we seek to improve livelihoods through innovation and best practice. And basic services, of course, is what we focus on. And we target underserved populations, including women, children, rural community members, people with disabilities, and indigenous population. And of course, as we say, we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We rather would contextualize, even if we find research evidence that's not from our community. So instead of conducting research every time, we seek to know what is already there. And which is why we are discussing on this session how to really look out for what evidence is out there from research and how to use it within our context. We exploit the evidence networks, like the PIRL network, like the GENE network, several other networks that exist that provide research evidence that is of good quality to low middle income settings. And we also think of systematic reviews. Yes, we can do systematic reviews, but only when it's absolutely needed. Slide. So some of our activities that we do includes training for evidence synthesis and use for consumers, policymakers, and practitioners. We also do a lot of stakeholder engagement activities, which helps us to gather qualitative evidence about experiences that people are having with using or with implementing best practices or using research evidence. We also roll out evidence-based interventions in basic services, including in health, education, local governance, environment, finance, and energy. Slide. So we have the key question is there existing evidence? And the truth is, most of what we have out there or what we think of doing has been researched before. Someone has done some research on it and it's available and could be a good start point for you. So it's always important to ask the question, is there existing evidence? And what we do at eBase is that we get policymakers, practitioners, and consumers to bring us their evidence questions on a topic. Like any one of you can come up to us and say, I would like to know what works if I want to increase access of children with disabilities to classrooms. And we would work on this to develop something we call a PICO. And this PICO stands for, will identify a population, an intervention, a control, and an outcome of interest. That means, for example, the population in this case will be children with disabilities, and the intervention will be access to classrooms or interventions that would allow them to access classrooms. This may include ramps, wheelchairs. For those who are visually impaired, this could also include Braille and other things. Now, intervention, we can look for a control, and usually the control is what is being done at the moment, which may not be evidence-based. And the outcome of interest, we usually develop it in collaboration with the stakeholders. For example, we may want to talk with people with disabilities and ask them that what will be the most important thing that you will want to see if we say that you have accessed the classroom? Is it just getting into the classroom, or getting into the classroom and being comfortable despite the disability, or having in place other things apart from just the ramp? So like that, we can really further define our intervention. And we then identify this question on the evidence ecosystem. So on our right-hand side, we have an image of the JBI model of evidence-based healthcare, which shows us the evidence ecosystem, which starts from global health, or that could also be global education or global finance. And then the next step is evidence generation. This is primary studies, like a study that someone carried primarily, or is the first study, kind of. Then the second one in blue is evidence synthesis. This is when someone has been able to put together all the research that has been done on a particular topic. And then next to that in purple, we have evidence transfer. After the evidence has been put together, it's normally reported in quite complicated language, and you may need to transfer it to a language that everyone can understand. Like instead of saying odds ratios, effect size, and things like that, we could put this in terms of months gained or disability adjusted life years, or this kind of easy language that people will easily understand. And then after that, you have the next one, which is in orange, which is evidence implementation. And in evidence implementation, it's a situation where the evidence is now, we've transferred it and communicated it to the people in a way they can now use it. So after doing all of this, when we take a question, we try to locate the question on this wheel that I have just explained. So for example, if it's a question like, or how can we ensure that kids with disability are able to access classrooms? Now, when we go and we do the search, if we find only primary studies, then we will say that that question is located on generated evidence. So we have primary studies. If we find systematic reviews, we will say that, okay, we already have systematic reviews. Now, when it is found on primary studies, it may possibly mean that we do not need to have any new studies conducted, because there are already studies that are out there. We may want to look at the quality of the study. If we find systematic reviews, then it will mean that studies have already been conducted. Now the evidence has already been synthesized, and we may not need to go on to do another systematic review. We may just use the results from that systematic review. And in that case, we may need to convert it to a language that can be understood by everyone, people in the village, and can be accessible to people who are visually impaired, as well as the general population. So that is how we locate and ensure that we do not replicate what has already been done, or we do not reinvent the wheel, let me put it that way. Once we've done that, we try to validate whatever evidence we got to say what quality it is, if it is trustworthy, and we still take it back to the stakeholders to be sure that they are happy with this kind of results that we have found, or if we need to do further work to get a better quality result. Now, the advantage of doing this process, there are loads of advantages. First is that it avoids duplications. Somebody has already done it. No need for you to invest that money in doing that. You can now reinvest that money to doing other things. And then it also reduces costs. And when I talk about costs, it's not just money, it's also the time. Systematic reviews can take a lot of time. So if there's already a systematic review, it's better to use that systematic review in your own context. You may work on it a little bit to contextualize it, to make sure that it fits to your purpose. In the center of this wheel that we have on the right, we have something there. We have, the first one is feasibility. The second one is appropriate. The third one is meaningful. And the fourth one is effective. Based on this model, what we mean here is, the first thing is, especially for us in low middle income countries, is that if you propose a technology, is it feasible? That is the first one. Then the second one is, if you propose an intervention, is it appropriate? For example, you cannot say that a technology like reading a book that is not on Braille is not appropriate for people who are visually impaired. So you may want to think about having it in Braille form. And then meaningfulness, what does it mean? This is particularly important for cases where you may have an intervention. This is common in healthcare, where you have some sutures, for example, in surgery, that are made from pork intestines. And you may have to use this suture on someone who is a Muslim. So it may mean something else for a Muslim, and it may mean something else for a Christian. So it's important to know what does that mean. And then we now want to ask ourselves also, is it effective? So these are the four things that we bring in when we are looking at contextualizing the evidence to our local context. Then the final step is rendering existing evidence. The final advantage is rendering existing evidence useful, because you will also agree with me that when people put in a lot of time and money into doing a systematic review, and then the results just lie there without being used, it's a lot of, it's very discouraging. So actually looking at what is already existing and using that one is also rendering existing evidence useful. Slide.
I'm going to give you a chance to take your breath before I move on to the next slide. You have covered so much ground.
Okay.
You have covered so much ground in this slide that I know that we've lost a few people. It may be very clear to you, but I just want to remind people that we're all in different places, we're all learning different things. And if there are terms or words or concepts that Dr. Okwen has used, such as systematic review or PICO or something, I see that there's a chat going on about PICO. There are a number of ideas that you've talked about, Dr. Okwen, that I think people will want to discuss in more detail.
Okay. So please feel free to throw some questions to ask for more light in the chat box. We'll do our best to respond to them. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, the WACA project, and the family toolkit. So basically the WACA project was funded by WACA Foundation in Holland. And the idea was for us to use research evidence to improve the livelihoods of for people with disabilities in Cameroon. So before we started, we developed an evidence question. And that evidence question was, what interventions are effective in improving livelihoods for people with disabilities in Cameroon? So that is the basic questions. When we look at this question, we have a population, which is people with disabilities in Cameroon. And the interventions are effective interventions that have been reported in literature that can improve health, education, empowerment, social well-being, and their livelihoods. And presently doing, people, governments, development agencies are currently doing. And the outcome of interest that we had, our primary outcome was that the rights of people with disabilities are respected. Then also that the needs of people with disabilities are well known and established. And because that would be the first stage for the needs to be addressed, will be that we know them. We had many other outcomes which we will see in other slides as we move on. Now, the first thing we did was that we searched existing evidence. And when we searched several databases. And when we searched, we found 2,000 plus studies. And from these 2,000 plus studies, we had to go through the titles one after the other. And we finally reduced them to 150 studies to be included. Now, once we got these 150 papers all together, we realized that within these 150 studies, we had, or let me say 150 papers, because it included policy documents, guidelines, systematic reviews, and primary studies. We found out that we already had many national policies, but the national policy that was of interest to us was the national policy for Cameroon. We also found out that we had 6 guidelines, and these 6 guidelines included one guideline that was actually developed for community and families in Cameroon, specifically in the Northwest region. And then 5 of the other guidelines were actually guidelines that were developed by the WHO. And this was actually, the 5 guidelines were actually on health, education, social well-being, livelihoods, and empowerment. We also found out that there was one systematic review from the Campbell collaboration. And we also found out that there was the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disability. So we focused on this set of documents as the key guiding documents for us to be able to develop or to use this to transfer evidence of what works into households. At some point, we had to email some authors to ask them about more detail about their studies as well. And if we follow the wheel that I showed earlier on, we will also understand that we could locate our study on evidence synthesis part of the ecosystem, of the evidence ecosystem. So there were systematic reviews, there were evidence summaries, and there were guidelines, and there were national policies. Now, these guidelines that we selected was based on the fact that these guidelines had recommendations that were feasible, appropriate, meaningful, and effective in our context. So I see that there are lots of questions, but thank you very much, Nain. I can see that you are also tackling some of the questions so that I can also take some breath. But if there are any specific things that will still need that I particularly pay attention to, I'll be happy to also throw in something. Thank you as well, Etienne. Etienne has also been throwing in quite some light on what we've been doing. So thank you very much. Slide. Okay, so to go a little bit into the complexity of what systematic reviews could look like. Now, when we read systematic reviews or even primary studies, we will hear about effect sizes, we'll hear about forest plots, we'll hear about grade tables. And the question is, what does this actually mean? Can someone in a village in Bali really understand what is found on a forest plot? Now, when we look on the slide, the topmost shows us a forest plot. The forest plot is a number of lines with odds ratios, 1.3 and in brackets 0.5 to 2.6. There are a number of different lines that have been put there. Now, for the researchers, this is very clear what they are looking at. But for many people, this may not be very clear. So it is important that we get consumers, policymakers, practitioners to work with researchers to conduct research, synthesize evidence, and translate that evidence. Because when they go through this process, the researchers will understand that writing jargon like this is absolutely useless, because the population of the world that are actually researchers is probably less than 1%. So the rest of the world will not understand all this jargon and stuff like this. So we did, we came up with a way of transposing effect sizes at eBase in collaboration with some of our other partners. We take an effect size and we try to map it to months. That means that an intervention that has an effect size that ranges from 0.02 to to 0.01 has a low impact. So in essence, someone who is using that intervention will be 1 month ahead of someone who is not using the intervention. Let me give this in a practical term. Let's say there is a study that's talking about getting into classrooms using a ramp. So it shows that children with disabilities who have a ramp, let's say with physical disability, who have ramps that are leading to their classrooms, studies had an effect size of about 0.60 for effectiveness of ramps. So this is very high impact. This means that for a child with disability who is attending a school that has a ramp, that child will be 7 months ahead of another child who is attending a school where there is no ramp. So like that, we don't have to report the effect size as 0.60, which is very confusing. But we can tell the people that a child who is attending a school that has a ramp is 7 months ahead of a child with disability who is attending a school that does not have a ramp. This kind of language is clearer to the family members, to the policy makers, and to the teachers. And it is easier for them to make decisions based on this kind of examples. For example, the policymaker will understand that I'm leaving behind a lot of children with disabilities 7 months behind. And this 7 months is even when the children are struggling to adapt to getting into classrooms. If the children give up, they would actually you will not be able to compare them with the other children in schools that have a ramp. Also, to parents, this could be very important information because in our project, one of the things that we were insisting for parents before we incentivize their families was to ask them to join PTAs so that they can lobby for ramps to be built in schools, for them to join health management committees so that they can lobby that ramps should also be built in the hospital. Because if their families are not in the decision-making bodies, the decentralized decision-making bodies, they will be left out. It's the same thing that we will also put to teachers and to school heads to make them understand what it means, what this research evidence means for the money that they are investing in the schools or in the lives of these children. Slide. I see that many of the questions are being addressed. I'm very happy. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Nain. Okay. Then we translated research evidence into daily lives. This was our objective. We wanted to make sure that the research that was done by Zotero, for example, or Marvin in 2018, that the results of that research really goes into the households and the children with disability can actually feel it. So we had a number of categories that we had divided the different interventions into. We had things like health, we had education, we had empowerment, we had social well-being, and we had livelihoods. The example we have here is for empowerment. We actually had our biggest impacts in the areas of empowerment. So what we did was we engaged the households in prioritizing outcomes of measure. So after we searched the evidence, we looked at all the interventions that were done out there and the outcomes that these interventions were measuring. And we took all these outcomes and we discussed with people with disability and asked them which ones are the most important to you. And they cited them, we scored them, and then we put the one that had the highest score as the primary outcomes. We now developed evidence criteria that was used to audit and feedback households by community health workers. So community health workers, when they do their routine monthly home visits, we would encourage them to also ask questions around disability. And if there are children with disability, they would score them, they would do certain audits and then give them feedback on it. And one of the audits, one of the lines that we were auditing was empowerment. And under empowerment, we had participation in health committees. That means, did they go for health committee meetings in the hospitals? So as you can see, this graph on the right, there's a graph that shows us a number of bar charts. And in this bar chart, we see that just 3% of the community members or the people with disability had actually ever attended health committee meetings of any sort before our intervention. Now, round 2, which is the bar chart in blue, shows you that we increased this to about 16%. And this round 2 was done 2 months after the first round. So we were already beginning to encourage people, and we actually had family members, parents of children with disabilities that actually started getting involved in vaccination campaigns as community health workers. Now, we also had participation in PTAs in education. This did not change very much. I would assume that the time was also very short. And I would also assume that because this was done in the Northwest, where mostly community schools are ongoing, and probably some elite schools in areas where maybe there was not too much pressure, were still ongoing. That's how people could be able to go to meetings in schools and actually participate actively. And then the third one was for them joining in Jangi group. We noticed that a good number of the parents were actually already in Jangi groups, but this actually really increased. Then there's also joining of a support group. A good number of them were also in the support group, but we also saw an increase in those that were now joining the support group. Now, the key thing here to understand is how we got around getting this impact. We actually had to work from both ends, because the problem normally is not just from the people with, or the families that have people with disabilities not wanting to go to health management committees or education meetings or joining Jangi groups, but sometimes it's a stigma that's associated with it. So we had to work with both district health services in Bamenda and school boards in Bamenda to make them to actively reach out to the families with disabilities to come up for meetings. And it was the same thing with the Jangi groups. Jangis are small business groups. People join Jangis in order to save money, to also to take loans within to invest in businesses that they want to do. So we actually actively went out and looked for this group and created a link or built a bridge between the groups and the people with disability so that we reduced stigma. And then as I've discussed here, you would also realize that we did a lot to integrate what we were doing into the systems, using community health workers, using district health services, using schools, using City Council of Bamenda, and then going to the Jangi groups, traditional councils. This was actually integrating what we were doing into the system that was existing. And to go a step further, we decided to give some incentives to households that comply to best practices. For example, we tell them that if we see that your score has improved after the first 2 months by XX%, we will give you some money to start a business. And with this business, you'll be able to have money to save in the Jangi group to take another loan to increase that business. So these were some of this is the kind of thing that we did. So what the example I've given here is for empowerment. We also had similar examples for social well-being, for livelihoods, for health, for education as well. So I see there's plenty of interesting discussions going on in the chat. Thank you to everybody. So what were some of the key points that led to our success in this project? So I think the first thing was the fact that we engaged stakeholders and we had the experiences of users to help us with the design, the implementation, and even the reporting of the project. I do not have a picture here of one of our stakeholder engagements, but I have a quote from one of the experiences of one of the household members around stigma. So this was what this is one of the beliefs that exists around children with disability, which increases the stigma, keeps them out of schools, keeps them out of hospitals, and keeps them in the back rooms of the houses. So this woman said that another story I heard is that they will give you a particular time at night when you will take the child and place near the stream, and she will transform into a snake and go, because they believe that the child is a snake. So we had a lot of this kind of stories where people who have children with disability are asked to go and keep their children by the river, and that the child will disappear. And of course, it's possible that the child may crawl into the river and drown, or something else terrible might happen to the child, and then they will assume that the child has transformed into a snake and has gone away. And if you are a parent, you can imagine this kind of advice coming to you. You would definitely not want anybody giving you this kind of advice, so you may just abandon this child to the back room, and this child will remain in the back room like forever. So these are some of the things that stigmatize people with disability. We also did a mapping of disability. On the top right-hand corner, extreme right-hand corner, we have a map, and this map actually carries information that decision makers can use to take decisions for children with disabilities. This includes maybe district medical officers or regional delegates of public health or social work, because it carries behind it qualitative evidence of what these children are actually experiencing in their lives firsthand. So it is locked behind a password, and we only give it to decision makers if they need to use it to make decisions. So we map this by using a software called Magpie and working with community health workers who visit these households and collect qualitative information and upload it onto our server, which now populates it in these balloons. If you notice, the balloons are of different colors. And I think this is actually was actually an outcome around depression in children with disabilities. So someone who is a decision maker can actually see that, okay, the red balloons or the green balloons actually show that this child has reported depression on a daily basis. The yellow one shows, or the red one shows that this child has reported depression. Decision maker may focus their investments on activities that can improve the mood of the child with disabilities. Then we also were looking out for existing evidence. We looked out for existing evidence. And when we looked out for existing evidence, here we have at least two of the existing evidence. The first one here is the one that was actually done in Bamenda. Best practice guidelines for implementing family-centered care for children with disabilities in the Northwest region of Cameroon. So imagine when we were about to start this project and we were thinking, we have to do a systematic review. And maybe at the end of the systematic review, we have to develop recommendations. But after doing our search, we found out that some work had actually been done in the Northwest. So I think for us, before we got this, guideline, we had to email some authors. This was actually done, one of the work that was also done by Lynn and her team. So we had to email them to try to get the detailed report. So, because the trick is when you search evidence, sometimes the evidence that you even need the most might not have been published, and it may be existing as gray literature, or it may even be existing in a paper that you cannot access. So you will have to, at that point, try to find the authors of that project, and you will email them and you will ask them to provide you some, the raw data or the report itself so that you can use it for your recommendations. On the lower left-hand corner, you will also see the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, which was done in collaboration with International Disability Alliance and a number of other stakeholders. So this was also very useful in guiding us. There was also the WHO guideline and also the Campbell systematic review. Then in systems integration, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we used existing structures within the systems, the health system, the education system, the social welfare systems. We did not want to go and start identifying new people. We just work with community health workers from the district health service. Then we also, on the middle lower picture shows one of the trainings that we had to provide some training for community health workers. So we trained them on how to use smartphones to collect data, and especially because they are not researchers, we train them on how to get consents for using information from households, get consents from using audio recordings, get consent from using pictures. And what they simply did was they would go there and they would ask a set of questions that we have given them, and they can also add their own questions if they think it would be interesting. And they record this on WhatsApp. And the central group that is made up of the researchers, those of the team at eBase. So when they send this there, we now listen to the audios, we transcribe the audios, and we link the audios to the geolocation where they were doing the interviews, so we can know exactly the household that was sharing that experience with us. That is how we come up with the maps. So because this might have been quite complicated, WhatsApp was very, very useful because everyone knows how to do a recording on WhatsApp. So, okay, looks like the slides have jumped a bit. Okay, and then finally—
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what happened.
Okay. Finally, if you can go back one slide, Lynn. Finally, we provided incentives. On the lower left picture, you will see poultry. So for every family that complied up to 60% to best practice guidelines, we would give them a seed funding of 100,000 francs for an income generating activity. And we had actually prescribed for them 3 main income generating activities: poultry, mushroom farming, and rabbit farming. So this was because we were able to identify restaurants that can buy their products as soon as they are ready. So we kind of created a monopoly for them in the market in Bamenda. Slide. And thanks Lynn and Luis for clarifying some of the points, and also Nagel.
I think, unfortunately, we need to wrap up very soon. And we do want to have a little bit of time for discussion. So maybe could we move into
for
discussion
real life
now?
Example. Okay then.
So I think we're saying that we need to worry about what's in the literature because it's really important for getting funding, for sharing your results with other people. It's also your responsibility. If you choose to do work that results in some kind of new information, you should be sharing it and you should be placing your work within the context of other work. But the biggest reason is because you will have much more impact. Those of you, there's a few people on the call who were involved in the guidelines on family-centered care that we did in Bamenda, and you'll imagine how excited we were to hear that they were actually being used in another project and that it was helping the next group of people to make some decisions. So it's really important that we look to the literature and that we contribute to the literature. I'm going to stop there. We can share the slides with those of you who are online so that you have a chance to go through them. We know that many people are not as familiar with reviews and guideline documents. We'll invite Dr. Okwen back another time to really go into that in more detail. So we hope that we have developed some ideas for strategies for getting to know the literature. Let's open it up for comments and questions from the group, shall we? What strategy have you taken from today's discussion? Just either put your hand up and I will recognize you, your blue hand, or you can type in the chat. What are some of the things that you've learned about today that you might try in the future? If no one volunteers, I will start calling names. So Nain is saying emailing authors in the field of interest. Exactly. If you know that somebody is doing work, feel free to reach out to them and ask them what they're currently doing. Often people don't have all of their work published. Dieudonné, please go ahead. What's your comment or question? You will have to unmute yourself.
Problem with
I'm really sorry, but we're not getting you very clearly. Is it possible for you to chat in the group and put your question there? So another comment, how will you email an author if you don't have any idea of the work they have done in the field, especially if it's gray literature? Nain, do you want to put on your microphone and see and explain to us what your worry is?
Yes, Lynn, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, during the presentation, you had mentioned that we could email authors to get maybe their reports or what work they had done that was not published in papers or newspapers. So if you don't have an idea that this work had been done, but this work could actually inform you in your research or whatever thing you are doing, how will you now email those authors to get the reports they have done which have not yet been published? How will you go about it?
Well, I think I'll give my answer and then I'll ask Patrick to give his answer. This is why a network is very, very important. Maybe you don't know the work, but you might know somebody else who knows the work from your network. So if I'm about to do something, I might reach out to Patrick and say, you know, do you know somebody who's working in this area? Maybe I'm interested in women with disabilities in crisis situations. Do you know anybody else who is doing work in that area? Patrick, do you have any other comment?
No, I think you covered it quite well. The networks are extremely useful. And for me personally, it's the strongest point of networks, being able to benefit from the experiences of other people and the resources that they have at their disposal. This can really help you to.
Yeah, it's extremely important to be part of associations, networks, groups. So feel free to ask questions. People who know me are always, like, you know that I'm always asking questions of people. What are you thinking about? What are you working on? Who are you talking to? Those kinds of things. We just wanted to mention Zotero. If you are not familiar with Zotero, please check it out. It's an extremely important, it's only one of many reference management systems, but it is becoming a very strong one. It's completely free until you reach a certain level, and it will help you to keep track of the literature that you're finding. So we are out of time and we don't really have a lot of time to go back to our examples, but I think we've given you some ideas of what to think about if a researcher says to you, I don't think there's been anything done about disability in my area. You might have some idea of how to go about talking with them. I want to just linger for maybe 1 or 2 minutes on this real life example. This, if you have thoughts about any of these issues, leaving an inheritance, creating a bank account, all these other really important areas for children with disabilities, please put your thoughts in the chat, or also you could email any one of us and let us know that you have some thoughts. I'm just seeing that EndNote Web is also a good plugin, yes. We did not talk about guidelines. I think this third example was about the use of guidelines and practice documents and taking all of this information and actually putting it into practice. And I think that's another area that we could really spend some time on. So thank you all very, very much. We look forward to further discussions. The last thing I will say, actually I'm going to say 2 things, but one is we're always looking for topics for our webinars. The 2 topics in the 2 webinars in September will be on surveys and different things to consider when doing surveys. In October, we are not going to be having a webinar because we're having our annual PIRL Institute, and then we'll resume our webinars in November. So if there are topics or speakers, ideas that you have about what we should cover in the webinars, please feel free to send them in. The last thing I would ask you to do is either turn on your microphone or in the chat, just help me in thanking Dr. Okwen for this very, very helpful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Okwen. It was a very good presentation.
Thank you, Vero.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Okwen. This is Dr. Langsi. It was quite interesting. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Langsy.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Dr.
everyone.
Okwen. I enjoyed it. It was really powerful and it was mind-blowing. May God give you strength so that you can continue on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Okwen, for the presentation.
So thank you all for joining us. There's too many people on the call that I can't recognize all of you. Last chance for anyone to say anything.
Merci beaucoup au Dr. Okwen pour la présentation, c'était formidable. Et merci aussi à Lynn.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you to you, Lynn. Thank you to you, Dr. Okwen. And thank you for all the participants as well who contributed.
Okay, well, I hope you all have a great evening and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for our next webinar. All the best.